All right, I hope you're ready to have some fun with type tools. I'm going to jump right into things by creating a new document, and I'll close this one out so we can get started fresh. Let's go to File, New, and go ahead and just type in text, and we're going to basically go with an 8 by 11 inch size with 240 resolution. This doesn't have to be exact. You can use a different size if you want. Just give yourself enough space that you can experiment with these type tools. All right, click OK to make that. Now over on your tool column, regardless of what version of Photoshop you have, your text tool is going to look like this little T character here. All right, so as you should already know, if you see a little black dot where these tools are, that means there's a hidden menu, and you'll notice the T has that. So if I click and hold with my left mouse button, I get a pop-up menu that's got 4 different variations of the type tool. The standard one, the one you'll use pretty much 99% of the time, will be the horizontal type tool. These others are for variations, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but let's go ahead and get started. So pick your horizontal type tool. I'm going to come over to anywhere in the workspace I choose and just click. Click once with your left mouse button and let go. All right. You should see a blinking line there, a little vertical line, and that indicates where the type's going to go. Now come up here to the top, and of course this is your options bar that coincides with whatever tool you have selected. You'll notice there's quite a few options with the type tool, and we'll go through these. But just want to start with this one right here. That's the size. Now, if you're used to word processors, you know that you can choose fonts and sizes with Microsoft Word and other programs like that. Photoshop's no different. There's 2 ways you can adjust this. One is you can put your cursor over the T itself and just click and drag. So I can make it bigger or smaller. It's kind of a nice little slider feature. And if you prefer, you can also click on this little arrow to the right and then pick a preset size if you want to jump to a particular number. Now I'm going to make this fairly big so you can see what I'm doing, but it really doesn't matter which size as long as your eyes are comfortable with it. So for this experiment, just pick whatever's comfortable for you. Now we'll get into fonts in just a moment, but over here at the very left, I don't want to skip over this. This button converts between horizontal and vertical type. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to type something here. I'm just typing with my keyboard. And if I click on this button now, you notice it converts that lettering into a vertical type. All right, so just so you know, with Western characters, okay, with the English language here, or with any of your European languages, it's very difficult to read text written this way. Now you might see it occasionally on signage, just for whatever reason, but it looks a little bit odd and it's very difficult for most people to read. This method is designed for Asian languages, okay? That's what this tool exists for primarily. Now it's up to you how you want to use it, but I get sometimes projects where people want to use vertical type and they write it this way, and again, it doesn't look very professional, it doesn't look very good in most cases, depending on what you're doing. But I would discourage you from using this method for the English language and for European languages. I would suggest only using this for Asian type. Now, if you're doing something with Chinese letters, something in the Chinese language and Japanese and an Asian language that this would make sense for with a character-based system, then by all means. Okay, I'm going to go back to horizontal type. Now, picking a font, you guys probably already know how to do this from your experience using word processors. But if you highlight things in Photoshop like this, I just did this by clicking and dragging over the letters with the type tool still selected. I can come up here and I can pick a particular font. Now, your font list is going to be different than what I have, because what Photoshop does, it goes into your system and pulls out whatever fonts are in your system. So if you happen to be using a machine at work or at home, you're going to have the fonts that are loaded into that particular computer. So just be aware. This is not something that comes from Photoshop itself, it's something that comes from your system. So you've got all different families of fonts, and if you've watched the font tutorial, you know about script fonts and serif fonts, sans serif fonts, and type display fonts. So just, pick a font you're comfortable with, you want to try, and you can see you can cycle through these. Now, as you make your decision on what kind of font you want to use, you'll probably also want to adjust the size at some point, and I already showed you how to do that, but just so you know, you can highlight lettering and change it after the fact. So once I've typed something, I'm not committed to that, of course, I can come back. Now, if I want to change certain individual letters, again, if I just want to make the P a different size font, I can do that, make it larger this way, or I could scale it again this way by clicking and dragging, another method. Okay, now let's just pause here a moment and talk about a little bit about the difference between a type layer and a regular layer in Photoshop. Now, you already know the difference now between vector and bitmap, okay? Now, a text layer is a specialized vector-based layer, meaning that it is scalable without any deficiencies or without you noticing any pixelated issues when it gets larger or smaller. So as I scale this up and make it really, really big, you'll see that it's a mathematical line, it's nice and sharp, and it stays sharp regardless of the sizing. So that's one nice advantage with vector artwork, and that carries over into text. But what further separates a text layer from just a standard vector art layer or a shape layer is that it has specialized capabilities that only work with letters. So for example, things like formatting. I can come over, and if I have, multiple lines, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just hitting the return key, by the way, here, and I'm taking this down a little bit so you can read this better. And okay, now I've got a series of lines, and if I have center justify, it's going to apply a center justification much like it would in a word processor. If I highlight all these, center justify, okay. Move this out so you can see it. Just clicking and dragging with my mouse while it's in the move mode. There's left justify, center, right justify. So you get the idea. Obviously, you couldn't do this with a shape layer unless you use the align or distribute commands, but these are specialized features. And along with those specialized features, there are things that would only make sense to do with type, such as spell checking and finding and replacing text. So, some of the things that you'd expect to get from a word processor, faux bold, faux italic, and we'll get into some of the more advanced features in a bit. So for now, just know that this is how you get type into Photoshop in the most fundamental way. So you've basically got your horizontal type tool, you click, and you start typing. All right, now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the other adjustments you may want to make to type, such as color. So if I were to highlight, a little trouble here, we go. Highlight, just clicking and dragging again with my left mouse to highlight the existing text with the text tool. I'm going to come over here to the color box and just choose a different color. Choose red, anything on the color wheel will work. And you could do this, of course, letter by letter, paragraph by paragraph, one word at a time. I skipped over the anti-aliasing, but anti-aliasing is a feature that you should just know about, but don't stress about it too much. Basically, it allows you to smooth out the edges of your type, which is coming to play. Hold on, let me just zoom in a bit. I'm going to use my keyboard shortcuts. Going to hit Command plus to zoom in. Whoops, undid the typing there. All right. And I cannot use that space bar to move around, because if I do while I've got it highlighted, I'm going to delete the type, as you just saw there, so be careful. So I'm going to just click off of the type first before I do that. I'm going to hit the checkbox to accept this type. And now hit the spacebar to move it. There we go. All right, let's come back here and just focus in on this anti-aliasing. So if you have no anti-aliasing and you zoom in, you see that stair stepping? You see how that looks? Again, I'm just going to accept this so I can move in here. All right, you see that that is what it looks like when you have stair stepping, and that's the result of no anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is a process of softening that stair stepping effect at the edges. Now, when would you ever want to use this? When you have type that's 7 points or below, that's when you want to use this, okay? When it's super small, when you're getting to the point where you're just writing maybe the little tiny copyright element on the advertisement or something that's so small, hidden in a corner, but it has to be there, that's when you can take advantage of this. Because when you get that small, when you're into that range, I'll just see if I can quickly demo this for you. Go down to 6 points. All right, there's that tiny little letter P. Now, when you're that small, when you have a letter like that, and you go to anti-alias it, accept that for a second, see if I can highlight this. Maybe I don't have to. I want to smooth it out. There we go. You see, when I turn on anti-aliasing, especially on the highest setting, the smoothest, that P becomes so blurred it's hard to read, whereas these letters are fine. They look great, even close up. But when I zoom out, that P starts to look a bit soft. It starts to look a little bit blurred, especially in the shallower parts of the letter. So that's when none can serve you well. And now if I zoom out, you see the P is still pretty solid. It's still pretty easy to read, even though I've zoomed out, that little tiny 6-point P. All right, so just thought I'd throw that in there because that is something that's related to anti-alias. It's probably the only thing you really need to remember about it. Other than that, it just comes down to how much softening do you want. Do you want it sharp, crisp, strong, or smooth? There's not a whole lot of variation between these, but they do just different levels of anti-aliasing, different softening. Now, when I zoom out here now, I'm back at 100% where I should be to evaluate these things. I can just see with smooth that these look great. They look clean. They look better than they did with none, like this. And but the P just gets a little bit soft, okay? Especially the smaller you go, the more that's going to happen. Back up here. And, you know, if I were to dial in something even smaller, if that were possible, like a 3-point, it would just tell me, oh, whoops, hold on. All right, now let's try it again at 3-point. There we go. See, even smaller, it gets even harder to read. Obviously, part of that is just the size itself, but just a little trick with anti-aliasing. Anyway, keep it on sharp, crisp, any one of these here for 99% of whatever you're going to type. Just keep that in mind. All right, we'll take a look at some of these other features here in a bit, but again, up here, I'm just hitting the checkbox to accept what I do with the text tool. That enables me to get out of that little blinking line mode so I can come out and start making other edits. And anytime that you're back in edit mode, it's going to bring this back up. So just don't forget that it's there. You're going to either have to cancel it or accept the changes that you've made. Now, before I get into the characters panel, I want to just mention one of my favorite tools to use with the type tool is the move tool. And the reason being is this move tool, when you activate this command here, show transform controls, this is the key here, show transform controls, it gives you a lot of flexibility in the way you handle the type. So now that I've got this type written out here on 3 different lines, I've got all these different handles that I can stretch and grab. Now, the key to remembering to keep things clean is to hold down the shift key. So if I hold down the shift key, that constrains that corner when I move it out. Now remember that especially when you're doing photographs. I get this all the time with students resizing photographs. they forget to lock it with the shift key. If you don't hold that shift key down, this is what happens. You warp it, you stretch it. It looks awful. So you can either do this by holding down the shift key, or if you prefer, and I think this is even better, go up to the options bar after you've activated this warping and hit this little chain link here. That chain link button locks the aspect ratio, keeps it in check, and so it prevents any distortion from happening. All right, so I can move the text around. You know that. I can now, you've seen I can scale it. And you notice, again, because this is a type layer, I don't lose any quality when I scale it up or down. It stays intact. It's vector based. All right, now, another nice thing I can do is I can rotate it. Now, we talked earlier about vertical type. People saying, oh, I want to do letters vertically. Well, this is how you do it, okay? You're going to rotate it. If you hold down the shift key when you're rotating, instead of constraining it, what it does, it snaps. So you see how it snaps to certain degrees, and it's going to snap to that 90-degree angle, which is nice because I know that I'm exactly at 90 degrees. Now, if I'm doing like the spine of a book cover, something like that, or if I'm doing just vertical type for whatever reason, I can go this way, I can spin it downward. This is fine. Again, because with European languages, we read them left to right. Our eyes just handle text that's been inverted like this better than text that hasn't, that's, going from top to bottom. It's just easier for us, even though we kind of maybe have an instinct to turn our head to read it. It just seems to flow better when it's written this way as opposed to what I showed you with the vertical type tool. So keep that in mind. For rotation, for scaling, and for moving in general placement, this tool is invaluable, this move tool. It also keeps you thinking about text as a shape element, as a design element that's going to work in relationship with the photographs and the other design elements, the logos that you're designing with. So keep that in mind. Hit the checkbox to accept it. Once again, just like the text tool, little checkbox is going to appear over here. The keyboard shortcut for that is the return key. All right. Moving on now to the character panel, because this is kind of where, I'm going back to the text tool first, this is kind of where a lot of the things that are important in terms of fine-tuning your text take place. Now, if you haven't watched the tutorial on typography, please take a look at it, the design fundamentals. Hopefully you didn't skip over that, because a lot of what we talked about in there comes into play with these little details, and it comes to character and paragraph. Now, these panels can be accessed, as you saw, just by clicking on this panels button up here. You can also come to the window and find them there. All right. So first off, you'll see some familiar faces. The font size. If I select a group here, let's just say a selection of letters that are all the same size font. I'll come down here to my last line. This gives me an opportunity, once again, like I have here, to scale it. And you'll see if the numbers match. It's the same by dialog box. I can slide it. I can type on it. I can choose presets. So I don't think that needs any further explanation. Above here, again, this is your font choice. So nothing new here. Over here, you've got the beginning of a series of different types of controls that will affect the way that the letters interact with each other and the lines interact with each other. Okay, so I'll just take these one by one, and let's just go from panel to panel and go through these. And so let's start with leading over here. So moving from left to right, we've got the leading. Leading is a term that refers to the space between the lines. So it only is going to become a factor when you have more than one line, like we have here, when you have three different words, three different lines. And when you come into your text and highlight it all like this, and I come in and slide, I can interactively adjust the leading, which changes the dynamics of how these words interact with each other. So yes, on a technical level, we're just moving the space between the lines and the space between the words. But on a psychological level, from a designer standpoint, you should be thinking about how that's affecting your overall design. Is it crowding for a reason? Do we want the reader to feel a little bit claustrophobic for this portion of the design? Do you want the letters to feel like they're crowding each other? Does that help the design? Or maybe even a little bit of overlap like we have here. If you use different colors, you can still separate the letters even with some overlap. That comes back to your design fundamentals and thinking about how contrast plays into this. But think about how space, layout, how balance plays into this, okay? So when we stretch this out, look at all the air I'm creating. Look at all the negative space I'm creating between the lines, okay? That lets these words breathe, okay? Now, maybe if they become too far apart, it's hard to unify them. What's unifying this? Well, maybe it's the same color. Maybe it's the fact the letters are the same size. Maybe they're occupying the same general space in the design. Maybe it's the fact that they're all the same font. Remember, we tend to group by similarity. So when we see things that are similar in size, similar in color, similar in shape, similar in font, we're going to start to think, okay, these belong together, regardless of what may be in between. But if you want to take that further, go back to your lesson on line. Think about how lines can be used to maybe be drawn between these elements to tie them together. You've got, just right here, you've got this kind of invisible line just created by accident. Just, it's not physical. But again, you see how these rectangles here are grouped by this vertical line. Think about ways that you can try out different types of formats, things that might suit your design well, serve your design well, that are a little bit unconventional but visually interesting, but at the same time supplement the overall theme of what you're going for. Okay, and so there's a lot of things going on here when we talk about type. It's not just about how to do things, but why are you doing them? What's the implication of what we're doing with these tools? Okay, let's get back to the mechanics now for a moment. Kerning. We talked about space between the words, the space between the shapes that we've created here. Now let's talk about the space between the letters. You've noticed a kerning issue right here. There's a lot of space between the H and the P here on Photoshop. Kerning can be used to solve that. I'm going to click and drag. Now I'm bringing the H closer to the P. Okay. Now how close is too close? When I get close like this, if you remember back to the lesson on type, think back to what this is called. What is this called? That's a ligature, all right? When you have these letters so close that they intersect, they create a new shape. Maybe that serves your design. Maybe that's what you're going for. The space between letters, and I mentioned this when we talked about kerning, is really, in many ways, a more subjective thing because you have different shapes and sizes with different fonts. Often at times it takes a human being to look at the relationship between letters one at a time to get the perfect kerning. Because if you just let the computer do it, it oftentimes isn't successful. And we talked about this, but so I won't get too deep into it. But you can see here, for example, that R and that S to me don't seem balanced with the relationship that the other letters have created. So for example, if you look at this whole word, photographers, there's a certain established spacing that's going on that the R and the S don't fit into. They're intersecting. All right, so we need to separate them a bit. I'm going to come up here and just slide up that S a little bit, just create a little bit of space. See, so we're trying to create consistency. But at the same time, we're trying to think about the artistic implications. Again, do you want to make these overlap? We can highlight this and we can have them collapse on each other. If that's something that we think might be interesting to do, we can do it. That brings us to the next tool, the tracking tool. Okay, tracking is for the entire word. Kerning is for letter by letter. So I can create space between the letters horizontally, as I did with leading vertically. and then I can come in and readjust things. Say, for example, now that I've created more space, it looks to me like the P and the H are a bit too far apart, so I'm going to use kerning to squeeze those together. So when it comes to the details, when it comes to fine-tuning, kerning's your answer. Defining those relationships between two letters. And when it comes to the word as a whole, that's where tracking comes in. All right, so two different parts to doing similar things, tracking and kerning. Next up, we've got the ability to scale. So if you wanted to scale something only vertically, I can slide this, squash it down a bit, stretch it out. Now you saw earlier that you can do this stuff with the move tool as well, but this lets you do it by selecting individual letters or individual words and doing it that way here on an isolated level as opposed to doing it here on a layer by layer level. Here's the horizontal equivalent to that scale element. And if you change your mind, dial it back to 100 and it'll take you back to where it all began. Next up, we've got a few things that you probably won't use all that often, but here's one called baseline shift. And this again is something that you can do if you want that kind of drop cap feel. So I can come in and slide. Let's, whoops, I got to leave my capital letter, the P, alone. And I'm only going to highlight the lowercase letters. Move these up. And that's a baseline shift. So you can just see that we can create kind of a drop cap feel. And maybe I'll come into the P and make it a bit bigger so that it matches the height of these. So it just drops the lower part of that P down, creates a descender, exaggerates that P a bit. So if you like that look, if it feels right for your design, baseline shift. Color we already went over here. This is the same thing. I can highlight letters or words and change them by color. Okay. This third section, or the fourth section here, depending on how you're looking at it, this is all your faux enhancements to the letters. Now, they don't look quite as good as if they were done by the person who created the font. So sometimes with particular fonts, you're going to get variations like if I scroll down here, let me see if I can find some examples. Like here, you've got Coronation Script Plain, you've got Coronation Script Condensed, Extended, etc., etc. Sometimes you'll see italic versions versus regular versions. If you have those, chances are it's better to use the font that suits that need. But if you don't have it, in many cases you won't, you can do like a faux italic, where Photoshop is artificially creating the italicized text. You can do a faux bold. Again, it's better if you have the original font that's designed for bold, created by the artist, but if you don't, this will work. Now you can quickly convert things to all caps. You can do what's called small caps, where you have everything in caps, but you create a variation in size between the capitalized letters and the lowercase letters. So Photoshop looks at the lowercase letters and makes them smaller capitals than the uppercase. So if that's still confusing for you, let me just, it sounded a little confusing as I just said it, so let me just type out a word here. So here's my name. So you can see I hit shift and capitalize the C, so it's bigger than the lowercase, which I typed in lowercase. So if this were not on, this is what it would look like. Okay, so anyway. So as we talk more and more about these character elements, I just want to bring up a reminder from our typography lesson. And here's a little graphic that just brings back some of these terms that we looked at before, along as some new ones here. But as we get into some of these tools here, such as the small caps and the subscript and superscript, we can start to think again about some of these issues, like the X height, for example. Remember, your X height over here, this refers to the height of the letters in the lowercase area. Then the cap height is the height that refers to our capital letter height. and this area above the X height is put into play when we use things like superscript. So I'm just going to bring this down for a second, and let's bring in a new word because these have been played with enough that they're a little bit awkward. So let's go ahead and just type in Adobe, and I'm going to get rid of the caps option here. Let's just make this lowercase. And oops, I activated it again. Hold on. There we go. And now I'm going to go ahead and just highlight the whole word and just turn on superscript. Now you can see when I do that, all the letters go up into that, what would be the cap heights area above the X height. Okay, so just to bring that graphic back again. Here it is. We're getting into this area up here where the ascender's at, you know, up in this above the X height limit. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn this off. And let's come back to highlight just the lowercase letters and put those up there. And now you can see that's the proper way to use this, where you've got now the lowercase letters up into that area in the caps height area above the X height, so that they're hitting the top up here along with the capital letter, and out of their usual X height realm, let's say. And that's just the purpose of this look. And you know, it's again, it creates this drop cap look very quickly. And you can modify this further, of course, take care of that kerning issue to say, okay, that's too much space there. One thing you should know with all of these tools is that they still require tweaking. Just because they give you a quicker solution doesn't mean you don't need to go back and adjust kerning. Kerning's always going to be there, you know, looking at you, daring you to ignore it, because it's something that often creates major faux pas when it comes to bad type. And so it's probably the first thing you should be concerned about when it comes to laying out type, is making sure the kerning is not getting away from you. All right, let's not spend too much time on these. Subscript, you get the idea. So if I come down here and hit the subscript, it's going to put it lower. Okay, down below that height that we're looking at. Let me get this up a bit so I can go back and forth. Down below the bottom of the X height, down into the descender area, we're putting all the lettering down into where the descenders are normally at. Okay. Down below the baseline. Okay, let me come back here. Underlining is pretty self-explanatory. Underlines the type. Strikeout, this is for when you want to indicate that something's a mistake. Put a strikeout through it. Strikeout. Is always color coordinated so that it's going to match the color of the letters you pick. So here it's blue, down there it was red. All right. Moving on. Now, you got a few options when it comes to languages, so you can choose different language options for different characters that may come into play. The standard for us is going to be English USA, but there are other options, just so you know. If you happen to be doing a design in a different language, which you may be doing, we have a lot of international students. We have a lot of people using different languages. And of course, it's certainly fine for you to use a different language for your design work. That is more than acceptable. Even if I don't know exactly what's being said, if you can translate it, that's useful. But we're looking for visual design first and foremost. But yeah, certainly when it gets to your creative projects, if you want to use an international language, if you want to use Korean, Chinese, Japanese, if you want to use Spanish, you know, it's fine. I'll be fine with the Spanish. I'll be fine with the Portuguese. But if you're doing an Asian language, then maybe just cue me into what you're saying. All right. This is anti-aliasing. We already went over that, so nothing there. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up for character. Paragraph is going to give us some familiar options again. It coincides with what we saw up here, but this was just a taste on the options bar of what we have with paragraph. We have some more options with paragraph. And before I get into that, I wanted to showcase a totally different way to create type. When I first created type with the type tool, I took the type tool, selected it, and I went over and clicked and let go with my left mouse button, and then I just started typing. All right, so that worked for creating a few words. But when you want to create a paragraph and you're dealing with paragraph shapes, there's another method, and that is to take the same tool, click and drag with your left mouse button to create a rectangle. Now I'm not letting go of my left mouse button, I'm holding it down. So now when I let go, I've created this rectangle to create type with. Now, when you're trying to create a layout and you're worried about spacing, you're dealing with typesetting. And way back in the 1500s, an unknown printer took a galley of type, a group of type that he needed to type out, and scrambled it. And what he did was invent a way that he could basically take letters and just use them for formatting purposes, okay? And that survived to this very day. And that method is known as lorem ipsum. And it's just basically just means it's a group of dummy type that is designed for printing that is not meant to be read or looked at in any way other than a shape. So they've incorporated that into Photoshop CS6. In the past, you would go back and just, find a random web page, copy and paste a bunch of random type and paste it in there if you wanted to do some typesetting. Now you can go to the type layer and go paste lorem ipsum, and you'll get a bunch of Latin in there. All right, now that's too big, so I'm going to select all this, and in fact, I'm going to hit Command A to select all. Delete that out. I'm going to choose a smaller font. Let's go with like 14. And I'm going to come back to my leading, and I'm going to choose auto. Okay, so the space between the words will be automatic. The space between the lines will be automatic. And I could choose 14, which should match up quite well, but just auto makes it easier because if I do change this font size later on, it will automatically adjust the leading. Now, so if I don't need customization of that for any reason, that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and try it again. Go to type, paste lorem ipsum, and there we go. So this is the idea behind it. We get a sense of the shape that's created. We get a sense of what these paragraph commands are going to do for us. And that's the whole purpose. Okay, so now when I go and I select this random type, I can start to see things like center alignment, justify right. Click off so you can see a little better. There's justify right. I can see what might happen if I were to modify the leading. Go back to character and just make some leading modifications. Space out that type. Now as I do that, the rectangle no longer has room because I created this extra space. It's like basically now it's like double spacing in a word processor. So now I no longer have space enough to hold all those letters. So you'll see a little plus symbol in the bottom right corner there of that rectangle. So when you see that plus symbol, that means that there's more type there that you're not seeing. So if I stretch that out, now I'm seeing everything. Okay, so now I can see all that dummy type that I put in there. All right, so getting back to paragraph. When we look at paragraph, we're seeing that we have the familiar options. So once again, from here, the option tool, we can center, we can right align. So we have the left align, we have the center align, we have the right align. Now over here, we can justify the text. So if I go to justify, I'm actually making the text extend to the left and right margins completely. So I have a complete rectangle. This plays back into shape. Again, I'm not just going through these just to go through them. I want you to understand what the implications are. Now I have a more clean, unified rectangle shape than I would with a ragged margin. A ragged margin looks like this. It's kind of wavy on the edges, okay? So a cleaner look can be achieved with these justify commands. And you'll often see this in magazines because they want to emphasize that clean rectangular vertical column. So take advantage of that. These are some of the design tips that will make your work look more professional. But on a more abstract level, just think of type in paragraphs as shaped elements, okay? So this can be a texture. This could be a group of lettering as a texture. Okay, we talked about texture in terms of the things it could possibly be, you know, like pieces of wood or even strange things like carpeting, or it could be some random squiggles, but it could also be letters. Okay, letters can be, if it's a constant pattern, if we can make a pattern out of it, edge to edge, it can be a texture. All right. Anyway, you can do both sides with the justification commands. Now, the only difference in these is that the last line you'll notice is now on the left. Here, the last line's in the middle, or here it's on the right. That's the only difference. If you go to justify all, then it's going to basically force even the last line to be, you know, letter by letter, which for this case would be very awkward. So I wouldn't recommend it when you only have one word down below there. All right, moving on. We've got some other indentation options below this. We can do indent to the left based on certain amounts. I'm going to go ahead and just click and drag this with my mouse just to drag this out value by value. And as you can see, as I go, I'm starting to create a margin there with that indent. You can even have negative values, interestingly enough, and those will extend outside the area. But, you know, this can be a quick help in certain situations. You can do it to the right side as well. You can do it just to the first word, you know, to indent this like you would if you were working in a word processor like your English teacher told you. All right, people, that's enough for character and paragraph. Now, in wrapping things up for this first lesson on type basics, I just want to, again, stress the importance of when you're dealing with scale and when you're dealing with large type elements, like this word up here, Photoshop, the bigger the letters, the more important shape becomes, and the more important shape becomes, the more important kerning is going to be. So one of the biggest problems I see with people on their first design work is just forgetting about kerning and not paying attention to the space between letters. So I just want to stress that this kerning tool really is important in terms of making your letters even and clean. So I haven't been doing that here. I've just been bringing this stuff out just to showcase how these tools work, how you do this. So just to stress that, what I want to do is just quickly starting with a clean slate. I'm going to create another new document. And I just want to showcase what I'm talking about here once again. So if I type in a word and I will go ahead and hit the checkbox to accept that. When it's small, okay, here I've got a 14-point font and it's really tiny. I'm not going to be dealing with that many kerning issues. But as soon as I scale this up, and again, remember to hold down the Shift key to constrain this. When I start making a title, maybe you're doing this for your magazine cover, maybe you're doing it for your CD cover. But when you get large with your type, that's when kerning starts to become a bigger and bigger issue. Different fonts have different kerning abilities. So to showcase that, I will just go ahead and just bring up a display font. This is a serif font called Big Castle, and it's done, you know, fairly well with the kerning. But let's compare that with maybe a different one like Black Oak here, more of a display font, and let's type in Photoshop once again. Same word, same color. I'm going to scale it up, holding down the Shift key to constrain it. All right, and we start to see more deviation when it comes to kerning. We start to see less consistency on the spacing between the letters. All right, so, and you're going to see that variation with different fonts. different fonts have different manufacturers. They don't all come from the same place. There are different types of font. Here in Photoshop, in fact, it'll tell you the difference between the type of fonts you're using, whether it's TrueType or an Adobe font or what have you. It will tell you the basic type of font that's being used. But on top of that, there are different people making fonts, and they're not all equal. Not all fonts are created equal. Some of them kern very well, others don't. And you'll just have to experiment with your own to see, what's working well and what's not. So just be aware that they're not all going to be as clean as they should be. Here's a different font that I've just chosen here at random. Again, different results on the kerning. I'll go ahead and accept that. Let's do another to compare with. Let's try a script font maybe. Something a little bit different than what we've been using. Typing in the word, accepting it, going to my move tool, holding on the shift key to constrain it and making it bigger. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at these different fonts. Now, the first one, as I mentioned, did pretty well. And there are a few things I can improve. I think, again, this is very subjective to a certain degree, but it's something that you just have to eyeball and see for yourself, because computers have no mathematical formula for figuring out kerning that's perfect, because it is kind of subjective on one hand, but the other thing is letters are all very different. O's are very wide and round, obviously. T's are very straight and very vertical. H's are kind of a mixture of roundness and vertical, so there's a lot of variations to each letter. And when you start to sculpt and fine-tune a font and really make it look unique, you start to create even more variation, more difficulty for a computer to figure out, how should these be spaced. So that's where you have to use your own judgment. And even though it's subjective, I still say that, it's pretty easy for me to spot good kerning versus bad kerning. And so make sure that you pay attention to detail when it comes to kerning. I'm going to come in here and add a little separation between the O and the S. I think it's too crowded. I'm going to come in and I'm going to just bring the O and the H a little bit closer together. All right, the T and the O are a bit close in my opinion. They're a bit crowded. But these are just hairline changes. I'm not doing anything too terribly major, but hopefully it's something that when it's done, it will really look professional, really look clean. Nothing looks less professional than poorly kerned type, and that's usually just shows that you didn't make any effort to clean up the type after the fact. So I'm going to be looking for that on the creative projects. At any rate, this font, Big Castle, was much easier to do than, say, for example, this one. This is going to require more work. There's a gaping hole between the O and the T here, for example. And then the S and the H are much closer. So this one is so out of whack that we're going to have to sort of figure out, okay, what's a good relation to start with? Maybe I like the space between the H and the P. Maybe I'll just start there by bringing this a little bit closer, and I'll define this as the spacing that I want. So now I'm going to come in letter by letter and just tweak it one at a time, because otherwise it's going to be impossible to find the right balance. If I just were to rely on tracking to do this, it's going to maintain all those problem offsets. It's going to maintain all those problem relationships. It's just going to either contract them or extend them, but the offsets, the problem areas, will still be there. In fact, they may be exaggerated by the fact that we're using tracking. Okay, so once I've come in and redefined the relationship letter by letter, then I can evaluate the word as a whole and see if it needs further tweaking or if I'm done. Now, if I like this relationship, I can stick with that. But I think this looks a lot cleaner than where I started from. Now, if I decide that this is too close together, I can still use tracking to spread it out. But now that I've fixed the relationship gaps, this is going to be a lot cleaner. This is going to still work even though I'm using tracking. So I can go ahead and modify the relationship as a whole on a global level by bringing them closer together. You notice here, because I rekerned them, even though I'm collapsing the letters, they don't overlap. This close together, there's still some separation. They're still clean. They're still easy to read. Had I not done this, some of the letters would have overlapped, other letters would not have, and we would have seen the problems. All right, and that could be a good way to start off, actually, is to actually come in and just see, do you have situations where when you track it right off the get-go, are you seeing problem areas? And that might just clue you in as to ones you should address first if you're starting off doing kerning for the first time. Now, with the script font, this is hard to read, period. I mean, this one is so abstract. This is a really difficult to read script font, but that's kind of the style of it. Now, I wouldn't recommend a font like this if you have to ensure that people can read it easily. This is more stylistic. This is more of a texture type font that you want to use in the background maybe. But script fonts are a little bit easier to deal with when it comes to kerning because they all flow together. And chances are it's going to look kind of natural. You know, when you've got calligraphy like this, it's hard to tell, how much spacing there should be. Although you might see certain problems that jump out at you, like here the P and the H are really ridiculously close. So I'm just going to give them a little bit of separation there. And I can see, okay, now the letters aren't touching each other. But even with all these curly cues, you can see that there are problems with the overlaps. Just because the script font doesn't mean that you're out of the woods. You still have issues. Look at the letters. Look at the letters in the X height area. Forget about the ascenders and descenders. Focus on this solid group of where the meat of the text is. And look at the relationship between the lines on the P, the H, the O, and just see how they're relating with each other. Okay, that's some advice on kerning because it is an important issue. All right, I'm going to wrap up this tutorial, this first tutorial on type tools right here. And we'll see you on the next one. We'll go into some more things you can do with types. It's kind of fun.